us begin our presentation on emerging practices in this prime time where we have to undertake extra effort to attract your attention. But let's see. Basically in this presentation, in today's presentation, I intend to share with you standards and patterns that I have noticed along these past 17 years involved with agile methods. And the only patterns that I can imagine is those that are repeated in success stories with companies who are truly successful in the marketplace. I'm Alexandre Magno. I'm known because of Scrum. I've been involved with the growth of Scrum in Brazil. I spent some time outside the country working with international customers, and in February I returned to the country founding energy that has to do with emerging practices, which I will address now. Throughout the presentation, sharing stories and some points here, I will refer to these four dimensions that what I have noticed noted as the four most effective or most present changes and situations: identity, culture, problems, and solutions. You'll see these icons in my presentation: identity, culture, problem, solution. In the next few slides, I'll share with you success stories of four companies that I think are truly agile companies, not in the context of agile manifesto. And many of them were born before the Agile Manifesto. I'm talking about agility in terms of responding quickly to uncertainty situations. The first one, perhaps you're aware of it. Those who were programmers in the 90s, as myself, remembered this company, were proud of it. They admired it. It was my dream as a teenager to work for it. And unfortunately, at the age of 20, I began working with them. It's called Borland. And for the seniors here, you will certainly remember Borland. Borland was a company that became very popular, mainly in the 80s and 90s. And they came in the market with Delphi and things of the sort. And for those of you who don't know about Borland was a company that we identified as a pirate company. Our CEO was always talking and speaking that we had to imagine that the company was as a big corsair ship, and we had to behave like barbarian pirates. An alternative company where we were a company with an essentially programming culture. People in finance knew how to program. A CEO knew how to program. This was in the company's DNA, and it was very strong in Borland. But Borland became very successful in the marketplace, and at some time it grew excessively. Within Borland, we had the issue that we hated managers. We had many jokes about managerial positions. We looked at the companies that competed against us. They had managers, and we really devised a number of jokes. And Borland started to grow, and a number of problems appeared due to the lack of coordination. And we began to think that perhaps we should have some degree of coordination. Perhaps we'd have to find a way of aligning delivery and development and so on and so forth. At the time, we shouldn't forget the company culture. We have to find a way of coordinating. And somebody said, let us create the role of a manager. That person was fired at the time, certainly. No, we have to find a way of coordinating without manager, because managers do not fit in our culture. And I said, and then at Borland, they created a limit that you use today. Perhaps you're not aware of this origin story. why the daily meeting was created, under what context, and in what company with what culture. Look at the cycle and the nature of the problem and the situation that emerges from that. And the city, you know what city this is? You may be thinking, I don't know what it is, but it's very ugly, perhaps in Brazil. It's in the United States, a city called Detroit. Some of you in the Agile world have heard of this project called C3, a project where the XP was created, the X3 program, which failed, curiously enough. And Chrysler, it was a company in Detroit, and they had a very large, complicated system, payroll system, and fellas like Kent Beck and other people participated. Martin Fowler were involved in this project somehow. And they had a context where all people worked in the same environment, business people as well as technical people. And within that context, people had conditions to communicate among themselves. And what was the problem that they met? People stopped the business area, stopped communicating with the technical areas, because all the prerequisites of the project were defined in the minutest detail. So the technicians got the technical stuff, got all the details, and they thought, why should I talk to those big bores at the in business when I have all the details? That is, a company where everybody was involved in the same, working in the same environment, who wanted to improve communication between business and the technical area, and they had conditions for that. And thus, the ginger stories appeared. User stories was an emerging practice for this project in a company that was brave enough to innovate in the creation of the XP. You know what the city is. We're talking about São Paulo, a company called Senco. Many of you have certainly heard of Senco. Senco is a company, I'm ashamed to be a Brazilian who had heard about Semco outside the country for the first time. When somebody talked to me about Ricardo Semler and Semco, I looked at it, and it was a company of my city with a fantastic track history. And Semco came from a context with an absurd appetite for innovation and experimentation. Those of you who don't know about Ricardo Semler, research him a little bit, but he wants at all time to experiment and innovate. Imagine a company that is led by a fellow like this will obviously have a more innovative culture, a more open culture to innovation, and that is a direct influence on the company's DNA. And he was in the context, and Ricardo Semler had inherited the company from his father. And we're not talking about IT. This is outside the technological world. And he perceived something that was a big pain in the organization. People spent an enormous time complaining about holidays, about bonus, about coffee, about vacations, air conditioning, this and that. And he said, look, we are wasting an enormous amount of time with discussions concerning things, with decisions that can be made at the edges.
And then he created within that the structure of participatory decisions, and he took that to the level where the ends had autonomy, even to hire employees and things of the sort. Now, but let's never forget the entire story of who was the company, which was the company, what was the culture, who was the leader, what kind of problems they had. and the kind of solution that was created. Our last story on this part of the presentation comes from the city that many of you recognize. We're talking about Stockholm in Sweden, and of course you know the Spotify, and the story of product engineering from Spotify. Spotify, many people would today try to look at it as but they have a very interesting story. So first, it is an agile company. Since its creation, it is a company that used Scrum by the book for a good amount of time, and with a culture that is totally open for autonomy, because the company had a need for growth, for very fast growth without pressure for being profitable, because it was a company paid by investors. So there's an entire context behind everything that we have to understand. And they come to a time when they understood that for them, for a company within that context with a high grade of autonomy in their culture, they understood that the Scrum was very much squared. The Scrum was impairing the working of the team. So they thought teams require more autonomy, because the autonomy that is already given by Scrum is not being enough for what we want to do. And then they created a squads structure that many of you know. So what is the role that, or what is the standard we see in all these stories I told you? Well, I could, in this PowerPoint, I have there 24 stories, that is, of companies that I consider to be truly agile, that follow this same pattern. Here I showed you 4, but the pattern is that first, these companies, they know themselves very well before anything. They have it very clear, their identity. We are this company, we are like this, and we behave like this. This is our way of being, like it or not. This is the nature of our company. So these companies had a very strong self-knowledge of what they were. And instead of looking and taking anything that came up in the market, they looked very much inside to try to find what was disturbing them, what was impairing their work, what was preventing them from reaching their goal, what was preventing them to have 100% of compliance with Scrum or method. No, they said, well, we have this goal here, and what is preventing us from getting to that goal? What was reducing the agility in our company? What is preventing us, from getting there? So within that culture, they had that problem. So they started having practices that they sought after in the market, or practices that they developed themselves or they adapted themselves, but that had a direct link with the problem, with the culture and the identity of the company. So, and what did not work for them, they didn't care whether, well, if we don't do this, we'll not be complying with the Scrum or Shazam Bank. No, they just taken and remove this all. And that is how they create their own methods. So, of course, some solutions that were developed, they will generate problems and side effects, and they will continue with the cycle of problem resolution. So the main pattern of success for the truly agile companies is that the spotlights are all on their contexts. The market practices are a simple detail. They're not excited, well, there's a new fashion, a new something. No, they are in love or very much focused on their own identity, on the goals they have. And with this, they discover new things, and they try to find their own solutions with their own methods. And then we come to what they call it premature convergency, which is the number one enemy of agility. In a context that I'm talking about, a broader context of agility. Agility in the sense of moving fast in environments of uncertainty. What happens in terms of premature convergency, that I see it very strongly in the entire agile community. We put the spotlights in practice, not in the context. We find our context is horrible. My company is ugly. Its culture is horrible. But the practice they use in Spotify is beautiful, and the practice they have of such and such method is beautiful. And that other practice, the practice 2.0, is even prettier. So we are prematurely focused on practices without understanding exactly what is happening within our own context, and without being committed to our own context. We're more committed to the practice with which we are in love with than the very context that we want to solve. There's a video that I like sharing that shows this issue of premature convergency that has an association with a social commitment. Just a second and I will show you this video very briefly.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
For a noon appointment. Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks.
Well, what is interesting here is that when we look at this video, and besides the funny issue is that we find it absolutely exaggerated. Well, this is forced, but we see this happening all the time within our own communities, right? It is just illustrated in a different way. Então, a história do usuário, why are you using user story? Well, because I use it because everyone in the Agile community does. Squad, squad, squad. Why are you using squad? Well, there. Well, because everyone else does. Everyone in the Agile community does. So it is the same thing. It is pretty much the same idea that I just showed in this video. It is explained exactly by the same science, and we behave exactly the same way. Instead of the only difference is that instead of standing up from a chair, as it was shown there, you are taking practices. You are being excited with a practice without understanding the concept in which that was applied or employed. So this leads us to many problems of convergency. So the practice may be even great. I'm not saying that the practice is bad. It might even be aligned with your problem, but not with your culture. So we take the story of Senka there. A participatory decision is a very nice idea. And you might have the problem of people discussing coffee, AC, vacation, breaks, etc. But you have a leadership like the one of Ricardo Senna that loves experimentation, safe to fail, etc. No, this is part of your culture. So there's no chance of this practice solving your problem down the line. The copied practice might be great, but there's no problem to be solved by it. You're only just ornating your environment. Copied practice may be great, but you don't know well the problem you're trying to solve. Copied practice is great, however, it will be useless without the company really admitting the way it is. They find it's beautiful or ugly, this is how we are, this is what we are. And finally, the copied practice may be great, aligned with your problems, culture, etc. But what are the other options? What are the other options that I have? You will find in a premature convergence, well, this solves the problem. That is, there you go. What are the other options I have? How can I place some parallel experiments here to see what will happen or to see what would work better for me? This imposition of good, best, preferred practices, it will also make the culture of your company look like garbage. And that is why today we love, you go, well, why is Agile doing this? It is not working in your culture. Well, one of two answers you have. It was either culture or the mindset, which are not good. So, why? Well, because practice such that I wanted so much to employ here is not working. So you're once again having your lights all on the practice. But, well, Alexandre, then this means that we have to reinvent the wheel. We cannot copy anything from anyone. We have to start from scratch. No, this is not what I'm saying. However, since many researchers and scholars say solutions may not always scale, and practices are solutions, but the process by which we experiment, we learn, and we can adapt, that can be copied. So instead of copying what was the solution for Spotify, why don't you copy the entire path that Spotify followed to get there? Because it is very likely that your solution will be different from theirs, because it will be aligned to your problem, your culture, and the identity of your own company. We have done this. Actually, in the last 3 years, I was outside the country working with different customers from India to England and experimenting a lot of different things based on complexity, on emerging practices, and how did we do this with these companies? What we do today in energy? Well, basically, we follow this structure here as if it were a pattern for success, that is, and we use the sense-making process using health by Knafin, a frame that many have shown here already. But unfortunately, most of the people in our community does not use it, or use something else to use a categorization. We use Knafin for sense making to really help the company understand its own context, understand its own identity, culture, problems. And then we generate we create some maps. as the collection of stories, for example, this one here, or micro stories, the example of this customer here. So many of his problems were typed there in that orange shape that is more associated to folks within our labels there, and they are navigating there much more from obvious to complicated. So with this, the company has given a much better understanding of its contexts and what are the problems it has to face. And that we complement with Learning 3.0 to build practices looking at that culture, looking at that problem. So we follow this flow here of setting the problem. Knafin created an input for this, so it's still having an entirely contextualized problem. We follow the learning flow from Learning 3.0. It may have at most 3 loops for learning, one associated with search, and you're asking, who has already had this problem in the market? Spotify had. Well, there's one guy who talked in Agile Brazil, had this problem. I wrote these notes here. Well, I read a book that there's an author that went through this problem with customers. So, in other words, I am taking many different practices from peoples and companies that have been through problems like this. I'm collecting these practices. The second loop is the connection with the real world. Well, these people solve this problem with these practices here in other contexts. What is our context? What is our background? Once again, we have the kinetic input. So this is our culture. Would this fit our company? This, what about this? How about this? And this is something that you can stop here, or maybe sometimes you have to go to experimentation. So experimentation, you may say, for example, well, these two here that we learned, one at Agile Brazil and another one in the Microsoft case, they seem to be interested. They are associated to my problem. So, and we think that they would fit well in the culture identity of our company without talking, bad-mouthing our culture, our mindset, respecting people, respecting the culture we have, and then run an experiment with those two practices there inside the culture. And then they are sharing. The sharing, which is a very delicate point that we really go after this with our customers. We say, share your entire story, not only practices, share. Well, I was in this situation in a company that had such and such characteristics, such and such leadership. They were in such and such market. They needed to double their revenue, and then we found this problem and we solved it with this practice. Because when you share the entire story, then you have the context as the main player and not the practice. So this basically the entire structure here was this looping structure placed within the book I published 4 years ago, associated with Learning 3.0. Of course, this is from 4 years ago, so there are things that evolved from then on. But these are points that have been tested, implemented in different places in the world, with companies in very different situations, but we see that it can be successfully used because it focuses on the learning process and not only on the final solution. And this is exactly the engine for emerging practices inside your own context. So we understand that this conscious work with emerging practices is the fuel. It is what has made the difference for organizational speed in those companies that we admire, companies that we would like to be similar to, or that we would like to do things differently. So another very interesting point, going back here, when we work with this flow, is that this happens in a continuous way. So working this way, it is very clear for your customer, for instance, that there's no agile transformation, there's no digital transformation, that this is a continuous process because your company will always have problems or bottlenecks or issues to be solved, and these points will always be associated with the context within the company is inserted. So he advocates here in his recent papers this issue of continuous next, to end with this culture, to transform this, then that, and then that. No, we are in the context. And there will not be a transformation beginning, middle, and end. We are in a continuous process of having found out the challenges and finding a different answer. The answer for that problem or for that situation, that issue, 6 months ago or 2 years ago may not be enough to fight the same problem we are living through today. So the idea of transformation programs, despite being pretty and easily controllable, reminding you that the idea of programs started with very different management styles than the one we are advocating here. This idea of programs, so we always have this feeling of failure, because at the end of the day, the waiting list is in the final stage, and 2 months after the end of your digital transformation, you start seeing many new different challenges there inside the company, and you feel, well, we are not that digital yet. No, but our digital transformation is over. No, but look at what happened in the market here and there, and we are not digital enough to answer this. So this is a continuous process. The processes we work of sense making from this, we generate heartbeat graphs where you see these loops here in a sequential fashion, because depending on the outcome you had from Kinetic, if you have an obvious problem, for instance, you will solve with a loop here. If you have a complex problem, you will need 3 or repetitions, many repetitions of the same loop. So you see heartbeat exactly of the continuous next. For instance, I am facing this problem here that was complex. I learned to solve it this way, and then I found this one here. I answered like this, and then after a chaotic situation, I solved it like this. And this generates charts and charts that after 3 months, for instance, the company cuts that, and it becomes like a flow heartbeat. And the company can then see, well, most of the problems that are happening here are complicated. I wasn't with a customer last week, and he told me, Alexandre, everyone is talking in all the meetings that the world today is complex, that the thing is full, and this and that. And we went to look here in our heartbeat, and we saw that 90% of the problems that most bothered us were complicated, and we could fight them inside, without any rocket science, without any, absurdity. So, but if you don't know your context, anything will seem complex, because you didn't look through it through your context. You didn't properly identify your problems, the culture that you have, and in what way you should work with that. Don't forget that there is a strong bias for us seeing things according to our own preferences. So if you are agile, if you are in an agile community, you will start looking at the market and see opportunities, agile opportunities everywhere. You will look at someone taking care of the garden and say, well, we could use agile there. Or you look at something in the call center and say, well, we could use agile there. Or you look at someone, I could use agile there. So and consequently, since in the agile world we talk about complexity, you will start looking and saying everything is complex, because they say now it's VUCA and this and that, and it will say, well, no, the organization is complex, any part of the organization is complex, everything is complex, because to be complex is the justification I need to sell to my boss that we need agile. We have to be careful with this, because if we look at the past for the track record, we will fall in the same trap that those people we criticized before fell. People from Branchart that were born in a totally different industry where Branchart was very successful, they looked at the rest of the world and said, we can use this everywhere. All we need is to adapt it here, there, and there. But we look today, and the case of death of BMI, BNR, is that they said, well, this is good for anything. You can manage anything with this. They were very successful within a company, and they said, within an industry, and they said, no, with some changes we can manage any kind of process with a universal solution. And today we are bad-mouthing it, etc. So we have to be careful so that the Agile community will not fall into the same kiss of death. In other words, for passion towards Agile, the manifest, and the big opportunity we have in the market today to want to create Agile manifest for each and every department with very little adaptation for any kind of paper, any kind of situation, and to see and believe that everything is complex today because we are agilists, we have complexity. No, we have stories in the past of other movements that did exactly this, and that is why we hated them, because they wanted us to develop software as they did in civil engineering. And today, many of us, we're going towards other industries where people don't do things exactly the same way we learn to do within the software development industry. The agile speed, agility can be universal, yes, but what I advocate is an agile with a small a to be universal, an agile that is much more associated with the agility movement, agility, the speed that the organizations require to deal with many situations, than the agile of the Agile Manifest. The agile of the Agile Manifest is very much welcome and revolutionized our industry. However, it started in an industry. It is not only changing one word or one term of the Agile Manifest that it will solve problems of other industries that we don't know very well. So, well, people, this is what I had to say to you here, and we have, I guess, 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Premium. I'm from Localiza Company, and congratulations on your vision about this topic. I think that this issue of common sense, the context, this makes the whole difference. And we see that maybe because of cultural issues, there is a strong trend to copy without applying good sense, and then assign blame to the technique or to the consultant or to the people in the team, etc. So this is a huge challenge to work. As I see it, it is a huge challenge to work with this paradox. But I wanted your suggestion about what approach. Of course, there is no cake recipe here. Maybe your experience will help in the answer. But what is a suggested approach to work from the viewpoint of those who don't want to employ this, this common sense in their daily lives, and especially when you consider those that do not want to apply this common sense, and they are sponsors or decision makers? Well, the first thing we have to sell is that, or we have to understand, is that we have to respect people. People have they behave because of a certain reason. So the person who is resisting, or the people who are resisting something, they are doing so because of some reason. What we have to do is find out what reason that is, because without that you can't speak to them, you can't talk to them. Sometimes you find that it is because there's someone on top or next to them, or the experience was very bad for this person. When they try to do something in another company or in another situation, something bad happened. And then you start a dialogue. You start a dialogue with them. Through this, you have a dialogue focused on what that person is afraid of, or what that group of people are afraid of, in such a way that you can show them there is no reason to be afraid using this approach. We could be very successful starting with sense making, because when you start from a sense making process, you are not selling framework nor any movement. There's no dogma involved. We're not doing sense making for Agile. We're doing it to understand the organization, the points that are impairing the works of the organization, the points of fear, and then we work based on that. So, for instance, I have a story of a customer of mine here in Brazil. As soon as I came back, he wanted to hire my company to launch 17 squads. First thing I told him is that you can't launch people. Well, let's try to understand here what you want to do. And then I managed to convince him showing some cases and asking some very punctual questions about the situation he was living through. And I convinced him to start using the sense making. Because with that, it was clear to us that they needed to improve the traditional process management.
Move from a really rough management, but we didn't have to maintain that. But, however, improved, better polished. So instead of looking at the squads, we began looking at the deficiency spots and began looking at this other issue. This does not creating fear in the organization. Well, now this has changed. I'm going to be in a squad. I'm not going to be in a department. And with this, you will decrease the fear, which is exactly what people feel. The frailty that people look and say, look, these guys are not here to sell a squad. They're here to help me with my context. And we emerge with our current practices. More questions? Last question. Congratulations on your lecture. There are contexts in which a company wants to change everything, as the case of Ricardo Semler when he took over Semco. One of them is called virando a própria mesa, turning your own table. He got the company from his father. He really had a fight with his father in order to do the things that he thought he should do, and the father broached space for him. And indeed, he changed the culture of Semco. He really turned Semco around. And the approach that you brought about learning, you seem to be preserving the culture. It works when you want to change culture or what? Yes, it does, because the sense-making process will tell you whether you need something more revolutionary. There are things, there are processes where you see that there are so many problems and they are so connected that you see that you are in a disorder. You need something rougher. So when you scan sense-making, you will see dimensions. When the sense-making process indicates to you that your issue resides in organizational identity or structure, then you need a tougher change, but abrupt change. But oftentimes you will learn that the matter is a flow or a matter of a style of a stack of paper, but you may continue with the same problems lest you change structure. There are situations where you have to turn the table, as per Semler's book. However, you cannot start off from the assumption that you have to turn the table without understanding what kind of table you want to turn. Most companies today, I don't know, Alceu. I swear to you, I visited many companies in the past few years and was surprised by many. We talk about the Agile movement. You need organization. You have to be optimized and so forth. And one of the most hierarchized companies that I visited was Lego, one of the most innovative companies in the world. They have a very substantial innovative potential because in their own culture, hierarchy happens or functions in a way that from here to here, where you have 60 levels, there are a number of sliders that reflect the hierarchy. And perhaps it would be more difficult to get from one edge to the other, one end to the other, without these sliders. Most companies, talking generically, so a few of them or most of them have to turn their own tables. However, many of them are making this decision prematurely without actually understanding what it is that they really need, because they're afraid of the competition, because their finance stinks, and perhaps they have something good inside. You may lose it. It's like throwing the bathwater out together with the baby. and you should analyze context by context. If most have to change to turn the table, they will notice, they will turn the tables. 1 or 2 questions depending on how long my answer will be. One, 2. No? Last question. So to Mr. Didn't catch the name, sorry. Well, Evandro asked me to ask you questions. Give us some sense-making examples. Examples of what? Sense-making, the application of sense. How to do it or what? Practices. Sense-making practices. Well, basically, there are several sense-making schools. The one that we work with is narrative-based, micro-narrative-based. You begin by collecting micro-narratives blended in people's daily lives. You can create channels in your company where it's as simple as, imagine this. It's your daily work in the company. You're going to talk to the PO, and there's something with this. There's some scratch with him that was the same of last week, same of last month. So we want to collect your narrative. Some things as simple as a WhatsApp message. You sent the message to your friend, and he will say, "Well, that son of a gun of a PO, he continues doing this and this and that." It's as simple as getting your narrative. When they're factored into your daily lives in companies, you'll see these maps. Then you will see that he was not the only one who was complaining about the POs. There's a number of POs in a similar situation. So the problem is not the person. The problem is in paper or perhaps in the relationship. So you collect evidence that will allow you to refine your narratives. With maps like these, you make the decisions. We don't have the key telling us what is the orange color or blue or whatever. You have a strong problem in the product owner team relationship based on the clusters of narratives that appeared, which require further investigations, at which time you suggest let us not have a PO, let's have another row, let's have a PO inside the team, and so forth. And in the second loop around, you look at the marketplace and say, what are they doing, those people who have PO problems? Then you start your experimentation. In our line, sense-making narrative was based on narratives and micro-narratives in the daily experience and life of companies. Folks, thank you so much. I'm available for questions outside.